Thank you very much. Well, that was a shocker, wasn't it? Let me just play this. So hopefully you can see the right screen. And we're in business, right? I think that's all right, all good, right? Great. Let's get started then. Okay, so I'm going to spend the next 30 minutes, maybe less, maybe a little bit more, talking about accessible typography and what does that mean? Well, briefly, I'm going to talk through a few things. You know, for many people, typography begins and ends with choosing a typeface, but there's a lot more that goes into it. So to me, accessible typography is, well, what is it anyway? I'll come on to that. I'm going to talk about what makes a typeface accessible specifically, because there are a bunch of attributes and values and things baked within the letter forms of typefaces that makes one typeface more accessible than another. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how we might use type in a more accessible way. So what I want to do initially is just sort of frame the discussion around about typography and accessibility alongside it. So the first thing to understand, and the first thing that I'm very keen to tell people is that typography has no rules. There are really just good or bad decisions that you can make with typography. Some people will give you a bunch of rules, and really there aren't. There are no real things set in stone about what you must and mustn't do. So don't feel like you're ever doing typography wrong. That's not that doesn't happen. You could be doing it badly, or you could be doing it really well. So and accessibility as well lives along that continuum of something that is less accessible and more accessible. So how I like to define accessible typography, and this is how I like to look at it, is it's a bunch of design decisions, a bunch of design choices that we make that can aid understanding and readability, comprehension, scannability, all of those things that good typography enables and empowers. But it also sits alongside WCAG's kind of framework. So you may have heard of this PAW, which stands for perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Now those are four kind of principles of which I think I'd apply to my typography generally, even if we're not thinking about it through the lens of accessibility. The results of good typography should be perceivable. They should be operable on the platforms that you're using. The results should be understandable, and they should be robust in many ways. So, so typeface. So there's three things I think that we can think of. We can think of it in terms of three facets, right? The first, which is the typeface itself, and then there are aesthetic choices, and generally most people think about typefaces in those terms, and generally those terms alone. But there are a lot of functional decisions that go into choosing the right typeface. That's specifically what I want to talk about today as well. The second thing is what you do with the typography. So what you do with the typeface, rather, the design decisions that you make something less or more accessible. And then there's the technical, right? So the markup, the CSS you use, what are the things that, and within native applications on mobile, so on Android and iOS, what are the technical things that you can do to make something more accessible or not? Now, there's a lot written about that online, and I'm not going to talk about that today. I'm going to talk about the other two. So what makes a typeface accessible? What makes one typeface more accessible than another? Why is Helvetica bad? Why is Arial even worse? So let's say what I want to talk through this is frame it on a recent project that I worked on, where I was asked to look across a bunch of products and services for an organization and make the output more accessible holistically. So how would you do that? What would that process be? How would you go about deciding on what was a more accessible typeface and producing more accessible typography over something else, where on earth would you start? So I'm going to talk through the process that I went through, even just, it was a few weeks ago now that I completed. So the first thing to do is to really frame the discussion for your work, for the start of your work and the process that you're about to undertake, but also the stakeholders, particularly those stakeholders who might not have much time to dedicate to the project. And really what that means is you don't have much time to educate them, you don't have much time to coach them through the natural messiness of design, and you want to frame the discussion in something that they can easily understand very quickly. So typography is this, to me, it's art and design. There's a lot of art in typography, plus opinions. And there are a lot of opinions about typography. Typography is not just something that a designer decides because it looks nice, this is the font that we're going to use, even if they think that that's what it is. Typography is like the voice of your brand. It's a valuable brand asset. And with that comes a lot of baggage. And with that comes opinions. And sometimes we have to tread very carefully, right? But those opinions can't often be articulated well. People can have very visceral reactions to typefaces, and they may not be able to tell you why. I've had lots of angry reactions, lots of joyful reactions. I've had lots of reactions which are just like, right? Because typography makes people feel things. And quite often it's that left brain, right brain thing. It's difficult to articulate what those feelings are. So if I showed you this marvelous example of I don't know what they even call this these days, death metal, black metal, some kind of spiky, scary metal. Looking at this, it makes us feel something, right? This makes us associate this type of thing with a certain type of music. There's a feeling there. And the same with this, right? Now, these are easy examples to pick on. Our choices for more accessible typefaces don't really relate to these because these are extremes. But typefaces, even with subtle variations, very subtle differences between characters and letters, when combined into words, when combined into sentences, when combined into paragraphs, combined into pages or interfaces with lots of labels, that aggregation can make us feel something. So, in my experience, one of the hardest things to do is to give clients enough vocabulary so they feel comfortable to articulate how they feel about type, so that we can all make better decisions, right? So some typefaces, so following along that thread of that process, some typefaces are more accessible because they have attributes that make them so, and these are the features that we can start to look for when we're starting to choose a new typeface. So this is the process that I went through. We have and in many ways it's similar to a kind of a normal design process. We have the requirements and the brief. Something that is a little different is this type audit. And then we agree on the requirements and the features. We get together a long list, and then we use a test, we iterate, we pull that long list down to a short list, and then we make some decisions based on some recommendations. It's not too different to many other design processes that many of us do day in, day out. Well, one of the differences is, and it's again to reframe the discussion around typography away from discussions around, oh, I hate that. Well, why do you hate that? Oh, I don't know, but I just hate it. Well, that's completely useless design critique or feedback, right? What can you do with that? You can't do anything with that. So the first thing that I like to do is to get to our list of requirements and features. We need to audit what's there already. And there's a lot that goes into that, right? Where are the fonts used? How are they used? What is the legal obligations? Design typography, again, this is to illustrate the fact further still that typefaces are not just a decision some designer made. These are a brand asset. They're software. They're legal obligations. They're often, they're distributed software throughout an organization. We need to think of web fonts. We need to think of fallbacks. We need to think of, on which platforms are these deployed? Where did they come from? What weights are they? Which foundries? Which service? There's a lot in the mix. So once you've got a sense of what that landscape is, and it can be pretty big and messy, then from that you can start to abstract this list of requirements and features. So this is what I got to with this project a couple of weeks ago. There's a bunch of attributes that come out. These are softer, more emotional kind of things. So we need to be careful about those. So saying something is authoritative, friendly and conversational, takes an expert eye. And it takes a lot of experience to frame that in a right way and to articulate why something is more conversational than something else. Because some people just feel that. They don't necessarily, it's not something that can be clearly communicated. It needs to be legible. It needs to pair well with an existing typeface. So there are other things as well. So there are features within the fonts. It needs to be sans serif. It needs to be, we need to have regular bold and italics. We need extended Latin, which means that we can there's Cyrillic and Greek, and we can serve those markets. We need to make sure that we've got a web font. We need to make sure that we've got a desktop font, which is an OTF format, and we need to know that we can license these on apps as well, which is a different licensing structure. So we need to think about the legal structure there. Then we need to think about, okay, well, what is the context for our accessibility? We need to increase the accessibility, but what's the context there? So we need this typeface to work well in long form text, but it also needs to work well in labels. Now that's one end of the spectrum to the other, really, in terms of usage. So we extracted some baselines. We have a high X height, open counters. I'll come on to talk about what these things mean in a second. Open terminals, a tail on the lowercase l, and then we want some desirable features like stylistic alternates. So those might be a different type of G than the one that you're given out of the box. There are a whole bunch of other, these stylistic alternates are fairly arbitrary font to font. So, but it gives more typographic freedom. There's more variance if they're available to be used. And then one thing that we were keen on, that there are letter form distinctions, because these can cause problems. So we just map that then into a matrix of the fonts that we discovered in the audit against the features, and we use that then for our long list as well. So the conversation becomes about, well, what are these features? It's like we're choosing software, right, against a use case. It's not about how does this font make me feel. The primary discussion here is a functional discussion. So I talked a little bit about some of these other features. So X height. So we have a high X height. So the X height is the height of an X, but also lots of other letters. And it's really a baseline attribute for a lot of accessible typefaces, is that they have a high X height. They have open counters. So counters are the spaces in between letters, spaces in letters. They're highlighted here in this rather lurid blue. Wide open counters are more accessible. And this comes really, all of these are to do with distinguishable letter forms. So this is a classic from Helvetica, right? Helvetica is bad because the capital I looks exactly the same as the lowercase l. And when you type the word ill, it just looks like 3 lines. And that's terrible. So there has to be distinction between letter forms. Another family of typefaces, not just one typeface, but a whole family that is problematic, is geometric typefaces. So an example of this would be Futura or Avenir. So those are letter forms that are based on a circle. So when you overlap those, right, there's a lot of similar shapes, right? And you can't see much distinction between the letter forms. However, so over on the right here, I have another typeface that has more distinction between each letter form. And those, you can see there that there's not as much overlap. And this is good, because when those letter forms are put into words, there are lots of tiny little differences that make letters distinct. And distinct letters are easier to read. A really interesting one for us on the web in particular, and I'll come on to talk a little bit about fallback fonts, is actually the metrics of the type within the M box. So this is called large on the body. This is a term that's been around for, I don't know, hundreds of years in typography. And what it means is that well, for us, what it means is 16 pixels does not equal 16 pixels, because there's an optical size difference between fonts. So what I have here is, on the left there is Proxima Nova, and on the right there is Times New Roman. So not that you'd use that as a fallback, but my point is here that these are the same size within Keynote, but one has a much smaller X height than the other. And as a result, 16 pixels set in Times New Roman will appear optically smaller than Proxima Nova. Now, this has real challenges for us if we're using relative M-based units for other things like our margins and paddings, and I hope we are, because our margins and paddings should be related. I think anyway, should come from our typography. That is a problem, right? Because if 1M doesn't, there's an optical difference. So all of a sudden, our margins and spacing with Times New Roman will appear larger than with Proxima Nova. I'll come on to talk a little bit about that shortly when I talk about some metrics. And the other thing is open terminals. So we make sure that terminals are having more space within words. So terminals that are open increase legibility. So skipping forward in this process, we did some iterating, we did some user research, we did some trying to understand, and got lots of talking to people about their thoughts, and we got to a kind of a shortlist. I'll quickly scoot through what that shortlist was. So this is Logical. Logical.family is the specimen site for this. It's a lovely, accessible typeface. It has very high distinction between the letter forms, and it shouldn't be lowercase, shouldn't be letter spaced. Again, I'll come on to talk about that shortly. But here you can see the distinctions between Helvetica on the right and Logical on the left. Cap I, lowercase l, lowercase I. So they're highly distinct. And this also goes through to the lowercase g, the L and the Q, and right the way through to the numbers. These are lowercase numbers. So you can see that the 3 dips below the baseline. And there are other numbers available within Logical, but it ships with these as primary. Another typeface we looked at was Ala by Dalton Marg. It's very similar, not quite so. It didn't quite have the letter form distinctions of Logical, but it was what I talked about. It worked better with tighter line length. So these are just some of the ways in which that I framed the decisions around how we got to this point. We got to this point with basically a week of looking at typefaces. I was dreaming about typefaces by the end of that week. I don't usually dream about typefaces as much as you might think I do. So again, we've got some distinction between the letter forms, which is pretty good. We've got the serif on the I, we've got the tail on the L. We don't have the serifs on the cap I, but it's better. Then we have FS Elliott. So this is another typeface that met our features list, but it's a lot wider. It has similar spacing metrics to San Francisco, which was a bonus given that some of the products were on iOS using native fonts. Here the I doesn't have a serif on the top. So then really the distinction here is the L, but it has a dot on the I instead of a square. So that also makes things a little easier to read. Saravec is a little more kind of vanilla feeling. It's a little more generic. It still has it had a lot of weights. It was very, you know, workhorse functional typeface. And it had our tail on the L. So the way that I framed this shortlist was as a little kind of diagram there are trade-offs, right? There is no, this is the way that I tried to explain it, is that this decision that we had to make wasn't about, you know, here's a typeface that is the most accessible. Actually, well, logical is the most accessible, but it's also the most distinct, which meant that there was more kind of character. And that character meant that logical didn't work as well pairing it with the existing brand typeface. So whilst we may go all the way over to being really accessible, actually in making something more distinct, we introduced some problems with the design there, because logical is more characterful. Whereas the other end of the spectrum, Saravec, less distinct, also less accessible, because there was less character definition, and therefore it was less characterful. So, you know, there was decisions to make along these axes. So that concludes that little part of the talk about how we make decisions about the typeface itself. And there was a lot of work that was involved in pulling together those long lists and short lists, because every typeface that we were looking for was had to meet some of those requirements. And really, it was like a checklist. And the first thing that I looked for was the little tail on the L, right? That was the defining thing. So, you know, you could go on Google Fonts, you could type in your own sentence of the characters that you were looking for, which is what I did. Lowercase L, I, cap I, B, 8. You know, there were a few of these characters where we needed distinction. You type in that into the specimen thing, and then it spits it all out, and you can really narrow down very, very quickly. So once you've got your typeface, like what do you do with it? And there's a bunch of things that you can do with it to make things more accessible or less accessible. You know, I have no idea how long I've been talking for. I haven't got my counter in my on my display here, so I'm just going to carry on. I've probably got like 5 minutes left, maybe 10. So typeface is one part. What we do with it is another. And that is typography. So the first thing is that we should use less weights, but we should make the differences between things more distinct. So fewer weights and fewer sizes equals a clearer hierarchy and easier comprehension. So this is what concerns me a little bit about where I see design systems with type scales that increment over 2 or 4 pixel increments, right? I think material does that. And I understand where they come from. I understand they come from the technical, from the platforms. But the challenge is that, you know, you put those, you make those kind of scales available, and all of a sudden you might have 2 pixel difference between things which, in an interface, which mean different things. That is harder comprehension. That is less accessible, because it's not as understandable what those 2 things are, because the visual distinctions is less. So I think that we're really this is kind of an exercise in restraint, and really giving yourself pretty tight constraints. So this is one of the things actually when we could only design with, remember these days for Ghana and Georgia, and you know, and there were only 4 weights. We got really good at typography actually, because we had to do a lot with very little, and as a result, we got really good at looking at these things in particular. Fewer weights, fewer sizes, clearer differences between things. You know, I said there were no rules. This is probably actually, I think this is a rule. It's certainly a rule for me. Don't do this. Just don't. Letter spacing is bad, especially lowercase. Type designers have spent sometimes years refining the differences, the distance between characters. And all of those add up to metrics within the font. So kerning pairs, so a capital T and a lowercase r. Somebody has decided optically, someone with a very refined visual palette has spent a lot of blood, sweat, and tears on that. So part of me is this kind of respect for the type designer's decisions, but also we can really screw up legibility and readability by messing around with letter spacing. So I said there were no rules, but I think certainly for me this is a rule. Minimize all caps. At the moment, we as humans, at the moment, we read uppercase and lowercase text. We read lowercase text faster than we read uppercase. And it's because of how our eye moves across letter forms. It's called a thing called saccades, where our eye jumps back and forth along a sentence. And it's all caps makes that harder to do. Now, I say that because these days, you look at Roman letters, right? There weren't any lowercase, so I'm sure they could read fine. Unfortunately, there's none of them to use a test. But at the moment, for us, don't do this. Keep all caps to a minimum. Just make text a little bit larger. We see this a lot from technical perspective. 16 points for body copy as a minimum, which is the browser default. I'd probably say go up from that. I think it's fine as long as your type scales are relative and scalable. Then go larger, go large. Why not? So maintain line length. This is a bit of a bugbear for me, particularly with responsive design, is that once your line length gets over 75 characters long, it becomes more difficult to scan horizontally. There are, to a point, you can mitigate this by increasing your line height. So the longer your line length, that's called your measure, the longer your measure, the more line height you need to make it easier to scan, because it needs more space above and below the line. So we can do some really cool things now with like clamp and stuff that just came out recently, I think. With this, responsive typography, we've got some good tools in our arsenal on the web to do this kind of stuff really, really well. So, I mean, that's just a really simple rule. So using the right figures, this is also really important. Text, so here are 3 different types of figures within a font. Text, or lowercase, sometimes called old style. They have ascenders and descenders, right? So the 3 goes below, the 6 goes above. Lining and proportional. So lining numbers, but they have proportional spacing. So they can be used for dates and certain usages within the run of copy. Tabular are tabular because they're monospaced, so they're used within tables. So think of accounting tables where you've got a column of numbers, they all need to line up. That's where you use these numbers. So make sure you use the right figures in the right place. The last one that I want to just touch on is this fallback issue. So here we have 4 fonts: Proxima Nova, San Francisco, Helvetica, and Arial. So that looks like it. That's a pretty believable fallback stack, right? So, but just look at the difference below of their positions. So large on the body. So the differences in the font metrics. So just for aiding this visually, I'll just put on there. So that's the top of the M box and the bottom of the M box. And you can see that there are variances in baseline, and there are variances in X height. And that can be problematic. It can be problematic for our spacing around things if our type falls back. Our layouts could be an absolute mess. So what to watch for there within fallbacks is similar metrics. So test it. And again, it's more of a continuum. It's like, what am I prepared to put up with within my stack? What am I prepared to be happy with? There's no wrong or right decision there. A few things before I just wrap up. A couple of things to increase the accessibility, increase the weight for light text on a dark background. This is because there's an optical fill-in, particularly with type at very, very small sizes. You can kind of lose pixels. It loses definition, particularly in lighter weights. So increase the weight, but don't go too much, because you can get this feeling, I'm sure you've seen it before, of the text can feel like it glows. Yeah, again, that's kind of fill-in. When you print letters like this, you actually get fill-in. The ink bleeds into the letters. Help the reader with good visual hierarchy, right? It's how we scan. It aids readability. It's not just about the little bits of type, little words of type. It's about blocks and chunks of type and how they relate to one another. A really important one that you could have a whole talk about is glance time and recognition, and also recall and being able to remember content. This is really critical in stressful environments. So, car dashboards, when you're driving, you need to very quickly recognize road signage. You need to recognize warning symbols on your car. Within health apps, airport timetables, when you're stressed, it has an effect on your cognition. So type can really help with that. So lastly, just to reiterate, typography has no rules apart from letter spacing. I think that is a rule. It's just good or bad decisions. We can have less accessible type and we can have more accessible type. But really, it's down to us to make those decisions. Thank you very much.
Well, unfortunately, since I didn't get to catch the talk, so I'm sorry if I'm asking you to repeat yourself. What are some good repositories for good, safe web fonts to use? All I use is Google Fonts. I don't use anything else. Is that like the quintessential place to find web fonts that are pretty free and clear to use?
Yeah, free. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's some, Google Fonts is big, right? And there's a lot there. There's a lot of choice, and one of the, there are excellent typefaces there, and there are terrible. Well, no, not really terrible, but there are the quality is. I mean, I know they try very hard to get only the best stuff on there. So it can be, it is a good place to go, and the service they provide, the uptime and all the rest of it, it's pretty great. Other than that, there's Adobe Fonts is really reasonable.
Yeah.
You can get an Adobe Font subscription, I think, with I managed to get I was paying for I don't know, it was like £50, so I don't know what that is. And, well, it was £50 a month. And I wasn't really using, I really needed, I've used Typekit before it was Adobe Fonts for years.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. So I had all my kits. It's a really great service, but I did, like canceling my my Creative Cloud subscription meant that, God, I'm going to lose all this. So I managed to find a way which you could downgrade to a subscription for InCopy for it's less than £5. It's like £4.99. And so you get InCopy, which I'd never use and never do, but I keep my Adobe Fonts subscription. It comes with that. So that's what I've done. Anyway, they're really good.
Okay.
Excellent.
We have a video request. Just going to ask a question. Try this out. Well, I clicked to add it, and now it's gone. I'm sorry.
Oh.
I'm sorry, Niles. I didn't mean to. Tried to add, didn't work. Okay, he's gonna add
okay.
us. David has a question too. Can you go over some examples, more examples used on projects? The audio. Oh, I'm sorry. The audio is rough.
Sorry.
Yeah, that can happen.
Yeah, examples more. Yes. So so before I went freelance again in when was it? March. So pretty recently, coinciding with this whole crisis, which was interesting and continues to be. So before that, I worked for a scientific organization, the European Molecular Biology Lab. And we undertook a big kind of redesign, new design system, new kind of really complex amount of products and services that the organization runs and produces and designs. So we went on the search for new typefaces for that project, and we were a couple of really interesting requirements. So the first of which was had to be free and open source. So already that impacts quality. Luckily, I mean, there are some really great either open source or freely available typefaces. In the end, we chose IBM Plex, and IBM Plex is an incredible typeface. IBM continues to invest very heavily in the typeface. Yes, it is IBM's brand, but actually it's kind of vanilla enough typeface to be used for other brands as well. So yeah, that was a recent example. We've got any other questions?
Yeah, no, question. Did you ever think that the size difference between body copy and headlines should depend on the ratio of base font size and viewport width? So that when the user scales base font size to 32 pixels, for example, large headlines are still readable, not too big.
Yeah, so here's the challenge with the responsive type, right? I think that, you know, V-units are really powerful. They've given us some really powerful tools for responsive design. However, if you are defining, there's a conflict there. So, well, there is for me. So my heading and body font sizes primarily relate to one another, right? Now, if you're using the width of the screen to determine what those base sizes should be, and therefore relationships should be. Now, so there was so basically, long story short, it's really, really hard, right? You can, and it's a lot of effort, and I've rarely seen it done well. However, I think it's a totally worthy goal. So there was a very famous designer called Jan Schickel, typographic designer in the early 1900s, 1920s, and he produced a manifesto of new typography, and in it he said that you know, the key to, he was talking about books, and he said the key to successful typography with a book is to derive the relationships of the typography to the physical object, and that's something that V units allow us to do.
Awesome. And that was something I struggle with too, is scaling things at different viewports and different sizes, and I never know what the right way is. I always read you should use M sizing, you should use pixel sizing, and I can never decide on what is the correct thing to do as far as sizing up and sizing down. What would your recommendation be? Like, what's the official answer? What do we need to use? Do you have an answer for me so I can stick to something?
There's no right or wrong answer. No, I think there is. So REMS, I think, is the unit of choice. It's the most robust. It actually across platforms, it's the most robust across browsers. I'd steer clear of things like, so there's the CSS unit X, which is supposedly the X height, but is not. It's the browser makes it up based on the M box. So there's a bunch of things that aren't available to the browser from the font file, and X is one of them. So I'd steer clear of that. So rems are good as far as I'm concerned. Yeah.
I'll have to start doing that. Okay, I've got a list of questions as well. We see, and I see this too, looking at a lot of branding all the time. We see a lot of companies trying to avoid experimentation, and they pick safe choices for websites and apps using typefaces already available, like fallbacks, the omnipresent open sans and others. Do you think it's a good thing that everything is consistent and recognizable, or are we kind of losing our personality as we do that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a quite so. You know, there's a few years ago, I used to work for Monotype, the big type foundry, and these are questions that I'd hear a lot from brands. You know, they're looking for a new typeface, but they want the feeling of one, but they which is often coupled with the ubiquity, right? So open sans. I think it's a challenge. I think it's and what it comes down to is that there are more choices available. It just takes work to find them and to communicate them well. The challenge comes when, you know, good typefaces are I wouldn't say they're expensive, because they're not. As brand assets, they're not expensive. However, there is a monetary value attached to them, right? And it needs to be framed that way. That this is not, you know, it's one of the things that kind of, you know, there's that phrase that Google broke search, right? And I think that Google has broken the expectation of quality typography through Google Fonts in some ways. It's also, in other ways, it's opened the floodgates, and I think that's a good thing for type industry in general, right? So, yeah, but yeah, I think it's about framing the discussion in the right way. You know, it's like having a room full of shirts and just getting the first one you can, you know, you just get in a white one because it's there. Whereas you could have a bit more of a considered process.
I would say picking typefaces is always a little bit painful for me, just because I hate using the same ones over and over again for different clients, and they don't know that the other person has the same typefaces, but I know, and it bothers me. You
shouldn't feel bad about that, right? Was it Vignelli? So, you know, Massimo Vignelli, very famous designer from New York, like all through the 60s. You know, he very famously said that and this was echoed by one of my, so I did a degree in typography, is what I did in university, and one of my lecturers at university said pretty much exactly the same thing, which was, you know, a designer only needs a handful of typefaces for their career. And I should be able to know these off the top of my head, but I don't. You know, he only used a handful of typefaces for every client. And because he knew them, and this is the thing, right? If you spend real quality time with a handful of typefaces, you really get to understand them, and you really get to know where to push and to pull them, and to know in which context they work well. And it's like the early days of the web, right, when we could only use Georgia and Verdana, and you know, we got really good at typography because we knew those fonts really well. We knew that Verdana looked terrible, big and bold. We knew that you know, we knew that small Georgia italic is one of the most beautiful typefaces ever drawn. And we only knew that because because of the constraints. So don't feel bad. I think in some ways, I think it's, I worked at the BBC many years ago, and all I used for 4 years was Helvetica Neue, Gill, and Georgia. That was it.
Wow. Okay.
And yeah, for 4 years. And I got to know those typefaces really, really well.
Yeah.
You know, and I still reach for Georgia now. Sometimes I'm like, oh, can I use Georgia again? And you know, why not? It's beautiful. It's an amazing typeface.
Oh, we got another question.
Got a question.
Oh, it's a long question. Do you have any apprehension about variable typography, considering your point about fewer weights plus sizes equals clearer hierarchy and easier comprehension? Do you think having more control over weights might actually lead to designer developers using less variation since they have finer control over the various weights? Or do you see things getting a bit out of control?
Yeah, the very short answer is yes. I do have a concern about it because you're absolutely right. Yeah, you know, Katie, thank you for your question. You're absolutely right. There's an inherent danger there that you know, just having all of these options available means that everyone's going to use all of the options. But that's not the fault of the typeface. I think variable fonts actually provide, you know, it's very exciting. They're going to be a great, you know, a great tool in our toolbox. But we need to exercise some restraints. We need to still produce our hierarchies based on, you know, best practice and best principles, rather than, you know, just all out. You know, yeah, there will be, you know, it's like when somebody gets a new thing, right? It's like they do everything with it, and I think it'll settle down. So I think really it's just about purposefully designing those scales from the outset, right? And carefully considering it with those things that I talked about in mind.
I mean, and having, you know, as far as using variable typefaces, I mean, that can also decrease load time, right? I mean,
yeah,
from what
yeah.
it can improve site speed and then allow us to, you know, have more do things that are more custom without like overloading the site with the ton of typefaces. So I think that's a great that's a great development as far as variable typefaces. But that's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of really cool work that people are doing on variable fonts. I think there are other things as well that are coming up that are interesting. We've got a few more more questions here. I'm trying to incorporate harmonic font sizes into my designs for a new site. Great. I kind of run into huge unmutable font sizes quite fast. Yeah, I thought okay. Interesting. So I mean that makes me think a little bit about type scales in general. Quite often, what I see, and I even saw this, you know, going back many years. We can be almost like a slave to our systems that we create for ourselves early on in a project, right? Mm-hmm. We create a scale, in this case, like a harmonic font scale, and we can see that it doesn't work at certain points and certain use cases. It's like when you do a grid, right, for a layout, you know, the designs that you create using this grid just aren't working. They're not feeling right working. So people spend a long time like laboring the design rather than actually going back to first principles and back to the design of the grid itself, and then trying again. So I'd say that those scales, and in this case the harmonic fonts scale, if it's not working, it could be that the resultant typography isn't the issue, but the scale itself. Scales are really interesting, right? So the font scale that we see in all around us, so 12, 14, 18, 21, 24, 36, that scale, that has been around for like 400 years, I think, 300 years. It's been around forever. Those numbers used to have names like Pica and Garamond.
Yep.
And the really cool thing is that has been baked into our design software. So quite often I stick with it, and I have to find it. I mean, obviously, with responsive design and scaling up and around that, it becomes challenging. But I try to keep the ratios because we're in the West, we're used to seeing those scales. So there could be an argument that says, the content that is generated on those scales is more legible, more scannable because it's more comfortable. I actually had an interesting thing which I took out of the presentation about. Somebody asked me about this piece of work that I did a few weeks ago about how can we make our typography more, or rather the content that we produce with the typography, how can we make that content more recallable, more retainable in people's memory? It turns out I read a bunch of studies, and it's funny because it turned out to be the complete opposite of what I thought it was going to be. The more the more uncomfortable content is to read, the more likely you are to retain that information. Yeah, and it's because your brain's having to work harder.
That makes sense, though.
Yeah, right. I know, right? So, yeah, sorry.
I don't like it.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, the client didn't either. I was like, you're not going to like this, but this is the deal. If you want people to remember your interfaces or some very important information within your products, we're going to have to set it in something terrible, and then they'll remember it. Yeah. So yeah, that was interesting.
Oh wow. Let's see. Ooh, this is a question that I'm very interested in. Slightly different topic. You've spent quite a bit of time around design systems in the last years. What are some of the most important things you've learned, and some of the things that are often neglected or forgotten?
Oh God, that's a question.
A loaded question.
Yeah, right. So some of the things I've learned about design systems, I think. I think one of the challenges with design systems that I've worked with, and and kind of peers work with, and is that they can feel very restrictive because they provide. It's like being given a predefined set of ingredients and a very predefined sort of recipe framework, but the designer wants to make something else, like a chocolate cake. But you can't make a chocolate cake out of mackerel and cucumbers. And right, so I know that's really extreme, and it's a bit of a weird analogy, but that's what I see is that some design systems, as we've come to kind of understand what they are on the web, are really just kind of they're components for manufacturing rather than elements to design with. I don't necessarily, I haven't seen many design systems that really empower designers to think and work creatively. I've seen lots that address the problem of scale by tech companies needing to make things without designers. So that is a challenge. I mean, if you look at design systems in other media, right? I mean, design systems have been around decades. and you look at them in branding, and you look at them in other disciplines, and they are quite loose. They provide a framework that they'll define typeface and colors, and then they'll just show a ton of examples of how these things might be applied. And really, that is to just give you kind of steer you in the right direction. But really, there's a very strict Otolaika, who's the designer who worked on he did a bunch of stuff, but his most famous stuff is for the Munich Olympics, which is this most amazing. I've got a poster on my wall actually from it. The most amazing design work. And he talked about that design system as having a very strict grammar that allows for free, playful expression. So it's about limiting the choices, limiting the very strict, but those are strict, right? You can't screw with them. But it leaves you enough freedom. I'm not sure if that kind of approach is even applicable to large-scale tech. I mean, that's why a lot of these design systems exist, is because there's not enough people and to work that fast. And this is about codifying a bunch of design decisions in tiny little things, and so that we can very quickly build things. So I think there are real challenges. I think that would be my big thing at the moment. It's kind of my pushback a little bit to design systems, is that I find them a little, as they currently stand, a little bit limiting. And they're also a tremendous amount of work.
Yes.
Just like, oh yeah. Once you codify those design decisions into, like into CSS, into React, into whatever, it makes it super hard to iterate because they're in a thing, and that thing may be in the wild, and it suddenly slows everything down, and just to change one little thing means 2 weeks work. That can be a real problem.
Absolutely. Well, I think we've got about 5 minutes left. If anyone has any other questions.
Is anyone left? Oh no, it's 15 people.
No, we still have 15. I don't know if that includes us or not.
I know. Okay.
But so glad you guys could all hang around.
Any more questions?
Yeah. Let's see. Well, I can go from my list here.
All right.
I haven't had time to think too much for myself.
Oh, Vitaly's popped in. Need to review a few mock-ups. Okay, where do you want me to do that? Where should I do that?
Well, okay. If nobody has any more questions here,
I'll go and. Oh yeah, I don't even know where that's supposed to happen.
All right. So whenever we wrap up, this is our last chance to ask questions before Mark has to go. Let's see. Chicken egg problem. Technology is here, but there aren't many variable fonts. Designers are particularly inclined to release them because there aren't that many designers that invest time into designing them. So what do we do?
Say that again.
Variable fonts, chicken and egg problem. The technology is here, but there aren't many variable fonts out there. And designers are particularly inclined to release variable fonts because there aren't many designers that invest time into making them. So what do we do with that?
I think we wait.
Wait, okay.
Yeah. It was the same problem when web fonts came along, right? It was because there needed to be this whole infrastructure, this whole thing that didn't exist before. And it did. The biggest driver for variable fonts right now at the moment from a kind of an implementation perspective is not actually coming from design, though. It's coming from technical, because it's one request instead of 6 or whatever. So that only really starts to come into effect at fairly large scale. So, but you're right, though. I mean, it is a big investment for foundries, and it's, you know, they don't go about this kind of stuff lightly. A variable font could take months or years. This is how long this stuff takes. So yeah, I think we just I think it'll happen. I think we just need to wait. There are other things as well that are really exciting and coming down the you know, I'm not sure when, but soon. So there are things like you know, Chinese, Japanese, Korean. There are challenges with those fonts because of the amount of glyphs in the fonts and the file size, right? There's tens of thousands or whatever, and the file sizes are huge. So, you know, font foundries are looking at ways to append new glyphs to a temporary font file in the browser cache. So you build a font over time based on the characters that are being requested. That's really exciting. That means that file sizes could be tiny. And they're also, you know, they're really interesting. So this comes off from things like digital, you know, advertising, right? If you've got an ad and it's got 3 words on it, you just want those 3 words in a subsetted file. But you may want to append that based on dynamic content. So you may want to build that font file. So that, you know, that's really interesting and exciting because, you know, you could think about that in terms of variable fonts, or because it's one of the criticisms of variable fonts is the font size is larger. So, you know, there are ways in which, you know, things could be tweaked.
Well, I guess we'll just have to wait and see. Not like we can do much else. Okay. Well, I think Bitterly is ready to start looking at mockups. I don't think we have any more questions. There's nothing else in the chat box.
All right.
So if you just want to come on in.
Perfect. Thank you so much for the Q&A and for the session. It's so wonderful to see so many people actually still around. That's great. That's cool. And thanks so much, Natalie, for moderating as well.
Yeah, thank you, Natalie.
Yeah, thank you. All right, I'll leave you guys to it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So, for those of you who are just thinking, what the hell are they going to do now? What is there to review? Well, as you might have missed, because during the we had a session during the first talk by Ying, and then we posted a little challenge for attendees to join us and design something in the time that we have in this meetup. And let me just show you a little bit the challenge first of what we had in mind. I hope you can see the screen. Yes, you can. Essentially, this was the challenge. You could choose either to optimize or design actually a car configurator that would work well on mobile. And this means kind of thinking about the ways of how you would design navigation, because there are essentially like 12 different steps. You're working for Ferrari, and then there is a couple of options, a couple of steps you go through in order to build the car of your dreams. And then there is also the one of the steps that was that design is the selection of dreams, right? And that had to work well on mobile. So we were looking, what people have come up with for this. And if this was too easy, there was also something else, which was an election map that you could design as well. 2 candidates, states, and essentially you also want to have a detailed view. So whenever you tap on New York, for example, you get to see how people voted in there, right? With different colors used here as well. And again, the same idea. How do you translate this kind of experience to work well on mobile? Now, what's interesting is that we had a couple of ideas that were kind of popping up in here, and they look pretty interesting. So I'm not going to say anything before, Mark tells us how he feels about them. Now, first of all, thank you so much for posting the photos of page 8 in your favorite books. That's pretty cool. But we also have some attendees who posted the challenges. Here's one of them. Janine has designed this. Let's make it a bit bigger. Can you see it, Mark?
Yeah.
Right, let's make it a little bit bigger, maybe. So, okay, so here we go. The election map. And we have 2 candidates. And the voting, the selection, and the states. You go. What do you think?
I think this is somewhat miraculous in the time allowed. I think this looks really good. I think it works really well.
Yeah, I think one of the things that comes up when we talk about this level of detail is that people have different pace.
Right.
So personally, I had a very different and not a great experience with zooming. It seems like zooming, plus minus seems to be such an obvious thing.
Yeah.
But when it comes to jumping from between levels of details, let's just say I want to get information about how people voted in a country and then in a state, then actually you really need to combine it with something else, like filters or search.
Right.
Because you might be interested in a particular county, right? And then finding that county in on a map would be probably quite difficult.
Yeah.
So having a drop down to select a state is good. Maybe I would add some sort of search in here as well.
Yeah.
Actually.
Yeah.
Right. And then here on the right, for particular results for particular state, we have results for Florida, and we get a bubble, I guess. On tap, it zooms to show closer up countries. Okay, counties. And then we also have a combo box where you can type in a country name with pretty much search. Right?
Yeah.
This thing is pretty good.
Yeah, it's cool.
I mean, in like 45 minutes or so,
Yeah,
I think it's really nice.
Yeah, very good.
That's very cool, indeed. In general, I think it's very important to think about filters and things like that. Mark, what do you think about this notion of many websites moving navigation to the bottom of the screen?
Or
filters.
Yeah, I can see why. I mean, it's just anatomically, right? It's nearer for your thumb. And so I think that's good, but it's not conventional. And that is that's also a bit of a thing for me. When you do something that's unconventional, what's the cost? So what am I saying? I don't really. Those are the thoughts I have. I don't really.
It is late for both of us. Yeah. So
it is.
Yeah, but I know what you mean. I know what you mean. Yeah. Okay. So well done, Janine. Thank you so much for posting this one. And then we also have car configurator by Niels.
Great.
So let's see what we've got here. So this is not a car. Okay.
Very good.
And so here's what we've got. So Mark, what do you think?
Those swatches are good. No, I think that that little kind of design language with the circles at the bottom with the little icons in. I mean, that's with the tires, with the wheels as well. That's very clever, right? What that does is that I can imagine being able to use this really quickly, right? You've basically got one kind of navigation device. It's the same visual cue for each, but what's in it is determines what you're looking at.
Yeah.
Right. And because when you talked, I'm not sure who's in here who was listening to you when you kind of briefed this, but this what was it, sitting on the toilet time, or what did you call it? You're so right. You're dreaming about your Ferrari for 10 years or whatever, and you snatch 5 minutes to just to reignite that little dream.
Yep.
And you do it maybe once a week, twice a week, whatever. This kind of to facilitate that speed at which you would do it. Because no one's going to buy a Ferrari on the phone, right? So I think this works really well.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I mean, first of all, I really like how big those tab areas are.
Right.
It's not like the tiny ones where you have to really hit a lot. I would probably make the buttons like save, share, confirm, and so on a little bit more like buttons.
Right.
I guess. Beyond that, one thing that I saw working fairly well actually is not having a horizontal area for like the circular area for buttons and things like that, but more like how would I put it best? More like a half circle.
Oh,
So
right,
you're kind of swiping all the way in.
Right.
So it also kind of fits well within Ferrari, maybe.
Yeah.
Right. And then another thing, then the final one is the move on button, the next button. I would probably put it somewhere at the bottom actually, because I expect people to accidentally misstep here. Maybe saving is cool, but moving on, like the next maybe in here. And finally, maybe, I'm not sure, but maybe there is no default. So if I don't select anything, is it automatic? Is it going to move me? Is it like smart default, or do I have to actively choose? Normally, it would be great if you could actually click 5 times or 7 times, next, and you had something where you can play with it. But it's good to have like the visual of the car being quite prominent. I think that's something that sells. Well done, Liz.
Yeah, well done.
Again, in like, what, 45 minutes or so.
Yeah.
And I think there was one more by Merla. Let's see. So you get to choose your car model here with search, and then you can view details. And when you tap on it, you get a few more details about that. And then once you are in it, it's like the swiping mobile thing where you can zoom in, zoom out, and you have navigation at the bottom. What do you think, Mark?
This reminds me of like a console game, right? You know, like a racing game where you're configuring your car, you're choosing it. So it was like the different size, you know, renderings of wheels, you know, and you could swipe through them. I think that that makes me think that there's, our worlds don't collide that much, really. You know, console game UI and mobile UI, and maybe they should. I think they could probably learn a lot from each other, right? Because they're very simple. You know, a lot of them are kind of terrible, but a lot, you know, there's maybe something there. So yeah,
sure. I think I probably would have not so sure about this overlay over here, to be honest. But here, I think that this one is like it's similar. But the thing is, instead of I'm just wondering how it would look like. Yeah, I think it could be done if it's like really playful and stuff. It could be really interesting to see how it's kind of moving around, and it's close to the thumb, so I think it's pretty good.
Yeah.
Not so sure about zooming in, zooming out, because probably if I'm selecting a tire, I probably would be focusing already on the tire there.
Right.
But beyond that, I think, yeah, nice. Thank you so much for submitting it as well. I think in general, when you're talking about video games, actually, for me, it's interesting because right now, just to wrap up here, there's been a lot of conversation happening around Unity, because Unity is working on some sort of 3D environment for conferences.
All right, okay.
Right, where essentially it's like a virtual space, and you walk in and you go to an exposition and you go to the booth and stuff like that, where they kind of try to bridge the gap there as well. So maybe, maybe in a year from now, we'll be on when we're walking in the VR spaces, talking to each other and speaking in front of a big podium and things like that.
Right.
Oh, look at all the books. That's something for us to explore later.
That's great.
That's great. Cool. Yes. All right. So, Mark, thank you so much for joining.
No, thank you.
I know it's very late for you. And thank you so much for everybody who's been listening to us. And Niels is here. And Niels has kindly listened to the feedback as well. Thanks for participating as well, Niels. Everyone, thanks. We need to sleep, I think. Yes. And maybe we'll see you tomorrow. We have another meets coming up in 13 hours from now. So we definitely need some sleep. Yes. Mark, are you ready? Could you give
I'm going to bed. Now? Yes. See you.
Okay. Thanks, everyone, and see you next time.
See you.
And good night or good afternoon.